Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Teresa Sweetland. I'm the Executive Director of Forecast Public Art and the publisher of Forward. We are going to get started with this incredible conversation today. So grateful that you're here. Our conversation today is Public Art Now, Leading Voices Sharing Public Art of the Moment. This is a wonderful public art policy discussion with Public Art Now guest curator Amina Cooper and artists Lava Thomas and Martha Jackson Jarvis. Again, this is me. Hi. I'm going to just speak for a few minutes about our organization, Forecast Public Art, before I introduced Mallory, and she introduced all of our guests today. Forecast Public Art is a nonprofit organization and a public art consulting and training team. We're based in Minnesota. I'm here today speaking from South Minneapolis on the stolen land of the Dakota people. I want to just encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat to others and learn more about the Indigenous people and lands where you're from. As an organization, we were founded 40 years ago, actually 42 years ago now, by a group of artists who were wanting to engage more in public and community space. And our mission is to activate, inspire, and advocate for public art that advances justice, health, and human dignity. I encourage you to check out our website, forecastpublicart.org, to find out more about us. Our work is expansive. We work in partnership with decision makers and stakeholders on arts and cultural planning efforts. We support public artists in funding their work, in training them, finding opportunities to create partnerships and advance their careers. And we also help others find, select, curate, and commission public artists. We customize training and capacity building efforts for communities, cities, organizations. We help administrators conduct equity audits on their public art collections and programs. And we recently kicked off a new initiative called the Change Lab, which aims to disrupt public art status quo, led by and for the benefit of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities with new fellowships. This year, we'll be kicking off national listening sessions across the country, funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, and also holding conversations about the future of public art policy, like this conversation today. With all of our work, our consulting, commissioning, training, policy work, we work extensively in the Midwest region, but we're expanding across the country. We welcome new connections and new relationships and partnerships and encourage you to reach out. Our team of consultants and facilitators are practicing artists, curators, architects, urban planners, youth workers, trainers, and we're working on 40 active projects here and around the country. And in all of our efforts, we prioritize creating opportunities for artists of color, Indigenous artists, local artists, and rural artists. And we want to work for and see BIPOC and Alana artists leading and fully reflected in public art policy and engagement initiatives nationwide. Our new publication, Forward, started about a year ago, is our way of introducing people outside of public art and arts to the value of that artists and creatives have in their work, from addressing everything from COVID-19 crisis to systemic racism, climate change, and more. Our third issue around community safety includes Public Art Now, which is our focus in addition to our policy conversation today. So I'm very excited to kick off the conversation, introduce Mallory Roxana Nazem, our curator of partnerships and programming for Forward. Mallory is a civic artist and consultant who believes that we have the tools to make places more just and joyful. And Mallory, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Teresa, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm personally really excited about this conversation, and it's happening because Amina Cooper is our curator of this current issue of Public Art Now. Next slide. So who is Amina? She is multiple things. In relation to Forecast Public Art, she is our current Change Lab Fellow. And she is also, as mentioned, the guest curator for Public Art Now, which is a special section inside of our new Forward publication. Next slide. So Public Art Now is a special section where our guest curator gets to select different works that they think are really at the cutting edge of public art at this current moment. So I'm just going to browse through these pretty quickly because lots of beautiful images and detail and Amina's amazing writing is in the publication that is linked in the chat right now if you want to take a peek at that. So one of the projects she shows in this collection is by April Banks, and this is in Santa Monica, California, A Resurrection in 4 Stanzas. This piece. It's beautiful. Learn more about it in the publication. Next slide. This work is in Charlotte, North Carolina by the artist Jessica Moss. It's called the Roll Up CLT. It's a beautiful community project. Next slide. This one I have actually been able to see. It's in Atlanta on the Beltline, which is an urban greenway there, by Dr. Fahamu Pecou. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. Amina, am I? Okay, great, thank you. And this is called We Can't Cop Cars Without Seeing Cop Cars. Amazing title, amazing piece. Check it out in the issue. The next slide, many of you probably know this piece. It's pretty iconic. Actually, next slide. There it is. Simone Leigh's brick house at the High Line in New York. I've also had the privilege of seeing this piece. Absolutely gorgeous. Next slide. This is the last piece featured in the current issue of Public Art Now, is by Abigail DeVille in Madison Square Park, also in New York. And this piece is called Light of Freedom. Beautifully visible any time of day, but this image obviously is a snowy winter evening in New York. So these are an example of the works that Amina features in the Public Art Now issue. And this is kind of our launching off point to have our conversation today with 2 amazing artists. Next slide. And they're here, Lava Thomas. Lava, you can wave hello to everyone. Lava is an artist who tackles issues of race, gender, representation, and memorialization through a multidisciplinary practice that spans drawing, painting, photography, sculpture, and site-specific installations. And she draws from her family's Southern roots, current and historical sociopolitical events, intersectional feminism, and African-American protest and devotional traditions. And Thomas's practice centers ideas that amplify visibility, healing, and empowerment in the face of erasure, trauma, and oppression. Amazing work. More about Lava can be found on our event invite if you really want to dive into Lava's work a bit more. Also, her website is linked there. So thank you for joining us, Lava. And then Martha Jackson Jarvis is also joining us today, based in Washington, D.C. Martha's sculptures have been exhibited in solo and group exhibitions in galleries and museums throughout the United States and abroad, and is also doing work in public space. Her work has been at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York Snug Harbor Cultural Center on Staten Island, all over the US, galleries in Moscow, and other places around the world. Her numerous awards include the Creative Capital Grant, Virginia Groot Fellowship, National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and many other awards and acknowledgements. And we're so excited, Martha, to have you with us. And again, more about Martha can be found on the event link to her website and more of her bio. So these are our 3 amazing speakers. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Amina Cooper.
I remembered to take myself off mute. Hi, everybody. Hello and Happy New Year. I want to sincerely thank you all for joining this conversation today. And I want to give a very special thanks to Mallory, Jen, Teresa, and everybody at Forecast for supporting and organizing this talk. And thank you for those great introductions. My name is Amina Cooper. I am a public art project manager consultant, and I'm currently working with Forecast on a research fellowship project that explores public art projects created by Black artists, and particularly the policies that impact the work that they do. And I wanted to bring Lava and Martha together for this conversation because they are both just magnificent, brilliant Black women working in the field of public art from both coasts of the United States. Martha has been working in the field of public art for a few decades now. And Lava recently integrated public art into a very extremely impressive practice in visual arts, working in the gallery museum context. I thought having both of them here today to share their experiences and perspectives would give us a great lens to view current issues in public art policy, especially in the way that they impact the work that Black artists and artists of color do, and especially how artists or communities of color are able to engage with those works. So this won't be a big deep dive into their works. I really wanted to be able to tackle policy and tap into the other area of their expertise and their genius, which is their hands-on experience working in the public art ecosystem, getting their perspectives and ideas and tapping into how they develop their concepts and their experiences working in the field. So I hope that that is of interest to you. I think this is going to be a great conversation, and I'm so grateful and honored, Martha and Lava, that you would join us here today to share some of your genius and your wonderful ideas. So thank you so much. So with that said, my first question is, and before we really sort of do a deep dive in, is I want to know if there's anything that was not covered in your bios and in your introductions that might help us get a better understanding of how you entered the field of public art and just are working as an artist. And let's start with you, Martha.
How I entered art and public art. I guess from my life experience, I guess I spent at least 2 decades doing temporary installation kind of works. I started out working with the base material, which was clay. And I was always not really building pottery, but building objects and things much more related to the building industry and how things were constructed in construction. So after maybe about 2 decades of doing temporary installations, and the gallery scene was not really a home for my work. It was always stretching out and beyond the boundaries of just inner space. I was really interested in working in the landscape, which was always kind of pulling me, if you will. You talked earlier about the tradition, and the Southern landscape is etched in my memory and in my heart. So there was something that was always pulling me from an interior space to an exterior space. So finding a way to move out of the gallery and move into working in space that didn't really belong to any one section or person, it began to belong to everyone. There was a notion of being able to work under the sky and have it become a commonplace for all. And I think that's the thing that draws me to public art.
Awesome. And Lava, is there anything that you wouldn't find in your CV that might explain how you started a career in the arts or were guided into public art?
Let's see. I've always been an artist. I've always been a creative person. Growing up, I was the kid who was either drawing or reading or playing the piano. So I trained in fine art at UCLA and California College of the Arts in San Francisco. I had an internship at the Getty in their conservation department in antiquities and conservation. And it was a program when I was an undergrad that was designed to expose fine arts majors to the field of conservation. And for a time, I thought that I would go into the conservation field. But at the same time, there was an exhibition by Carrie Mae Weems that just stopped me in my tracks. And I had the opportunity to spend almost every day of my internship with that work. And that experience really set me on the path and the commitment to create works that were and are committed to the ideas of social justice, racial justice. The majority of my work up until this point exists within museums, galleries, arts, other arts venues, academic venues in that context. And the way that I entered into the public art field, and I still feel very much like I just have my toe in it because I'm currently in the process of creating a monument to honor Dr. Maya Angelou. And the way that that happened was I was invited to apply. I saw the request for qualifications, but I didn't really think about applying because it's hadn't been in my wheelhouse, even though sculpture is in my toolbox. But I was invited, I was encouraged, and Dr. Angelou has been a hero of mine and a great inspiration since I first read I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, and I was in junior high school at that time. So I was incredibly, honored and humbled to be considered for that opportunity.
Right, and I think that that's important for people to hear, especially folks like me who are on the public art policy and admin side, is that, just looking at your work log, there's a clear sort of progression from like two-dimensional works and then an exploration of installation-based work. So, not necessarily waiting for an artist to apply, especially, artists that come from of African descent or artists of color to apply to an RFP rather than, cultivating them or inviting them to apply, understanding they have the skill sets and the expertise and the capacity to do those projects, I think is really important. Martha, I wanted to ask you, could you describe your very first public art commission, when that was, what the landscape was like for that, and if you've seen sort of the field change since that first project?
First, my goodness. Well, that's complex when I talk about like temporary installations. I guess the first really big public piece was kind of in the New York Transit Authority. Again, the issue that you raised about being invited in, it was an RFQ, and I thought, well, interesting, but it was through an invitation through a curator who had seen my work and had known it for the years. And it was kind of a nudge, like, why don't you just apply? And I'm like, okay, we'll see. And it was a very difficult project in that in transportation industry, there are a lot of specifications that must be met and safety issues and all of those things. So that kind of threw me kind of head first into that rubric of structure, safety, specifications that were in place, what could and could not be done, and then how to take these specifications and so-called limitations and then work with them in the broadest context of creativity that you could. So that was a real game changer for me. And it's really interesting because I was having conversations with maybe other artists and I'm like, well, public art, you kind of have to be told what to do. I've never been told what to do in public art. You have to be inventive and within these parameters, come up with what the possibilities are and be able to wield your tools or the energy as powerfully as you can to speak about the site, about the materials, about the community. So it was working with all of these elements. And there's also an element about the public, working publicly, that there are lots of different balls that have to be managed. So you have to work in the round, I call it, it's like 360, 360 degrees at all times. Where are we in that rubric of that globe? And finding your space, your creative space.
And Martha, when was that first project for you, the project for the transit system in New York?
This is terrible. This was probably in the early 80s.
That's incredible. That
Yeah.
I mean, just being a Black artist, being able to work in transit and in the arts is, you know, it doesn't happen often. So for you to be doing that in the early 80s, even today, I think the first work that I saw from you was your work at Van Ness Station in DC, and then also maybe the Anacostia Station, really beautiful mosaics. And it was just, it floored me that, you know, a Black woman had the opportunity to do that. Just, you know, so just kudos to you for having, you know, done that and really sort of been a trailblazer for the field. How have you seen things shift, I guess, from working, you know, from that time period and working today? Do you think things have gotten better, more complicated?
Both. They've gotten better, more complicated, and at the same time, it still needs to be, we're working on this. We're still inventing what's necessary for the space that we're called upon to work in now. Our communities have changed, people have changed. I found that, I have to say, early on in public spaces, usually when a site was built, the most innovative thing turned out to be oftentimes, you know, I hate to say it, the architects would build like a clock tower, and that would be like the end kind of dressing for the site in terms of art and creativity. So I've seen it come from that aspect of really being something that the architects dealt with, to the point where artists, you know, were invited in to be a part of that creative space. So that has changed, and that's changed wonderfully. And I think we've both learned a lot. Artists have learned a lot, and the architects have learned a lot. So I think it's interesting now, we both kind of work similarly, but differently in ways. But I've seen that those two aspects come together.
Okay.
You see the invention of things like landscape architecture. These are all delineations that weren't really there. It was just architecture. And now for someone to study landscape architecture. So things are really being fine-tuned, and we're inventing as we go, because that's being called for. So we're not there yet, but it's an interesting space, and questions are being invented every day, and we're trying to answer them, you know.
Well, it sounds like what you're describing is early on in your work, it was more of, okay, this is done, you know, do this thing real quick, and then the project will be done. And now it's being more of an integrated process where you're being invited early on into the design process, which is, I mean, always like a best case scenario. I think we have some artists, hopefully, you know, participating today. And I'm curious if you, Lava, you, Martha, have any advice from, you know, for artists that are really intrigued by public art, but have really, you know, cultivated a two-dimensional or visual arts practice, work within a gallery system, and are interested in making that leap. Do you have any advice, any, you know, avoid this, don't do what I did, sort of advice for them?
I would say seek out a mentor, talk to other artists who are in the field. That is something that I did when I decided to apply for this opportunity. I would also advise artists, if they don't have attorneys already, to hire arts attorneys, because the documents that we're required to read and sign are written in legalese. They're very time consuming, and are especially with public art contracts, are often written to indemnify the city and leave artists financially vulnerable. So it's important that you have an attorney to represent your best interest. I would also advise hiring a professional project manager. In my case, it's something that I learned a little late in the process. I think I wish I had done it earlier, would have saved a lot of time. My studio practice is very busy, and I'm grateful for that. But just learning all of the ins and outs of an entirely new process is extremely time consuming. So it's been wonderful to have a project manager on the team. Let's see if there's anything else. creating public art is very different from my typical studio practice where I am in control of the aesthetics. There's nothing that I do that's subject to outside scrutiny or outside approval in order to create it. And so this process of having to have almost every step of the process approved is a very different way of working for me. So it's been a steep learning curve.
I think it's, I would say it's important to, I think what Laura said is really important, but before that, you have to have the courage to try. Before you get to the contracts, before you get to all of those things, you must have the courage to try. And then within that, there is a tremendous learning curve. And I find for me, there's something important about being able to dissect a project. You know, what is the most pressing thing to prioritize, to learn how to do that efficiently. And I think what Laura has pointed out, which is really important, it's important to have, and what I've learned over the years is I cannot do it all myself. Mm-hmm. Right? What does that mean? That doesn't mean that I relinquish any of the creative kind of energy of the project or the meaning or, you know, what it is that I'm saying about the work. But what I can relinquish is some of the work. You need the expertise. I find I need, over the years, I've had to really build a community of creative people that I can work with, right? People that I can collaborate with. How do you do that? You're going to need someone who works, a fabricator. You're going to need a structural engineer. Laura talked about having a studio manager. Okay, if management isn't your thing, I like to manage myself, so I can manage, and I can manage the studio. But I do have things like a fabricator. I have an architect that I've been working with for the past 10 years. When it gets down to technical drawings, you must have an attorney to read the contracts. Before you sign anything, don't do it. Get someone to read it, right? And it has to be from an artist's point of view. It's not that someone's trying to cheat you, but everyone's working on their behalf. So you must have a group that will work on your behalf.
So Martha, let me just interject, because it sounds like both of what you are saying makes me think of what my job is as a public art project manager, is to be able to provide resources and even capacity building for artists, so that you don't have to, so that the learning curve isn't as steep. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the challenge is, you know, when we're trying to create a more equitable field, you know, the landscape for other public art administrators, I think, you know, the last data I saw is that, you know, the field is about 80% white women on the other side of that role. So I'm curious, you know, you're talking about advice for artists and how they need to equip themselves, but do you have advice for other public art managers or other liaisons that are supposed to assist you in how they can better support your work and engage with you so that you can mount your best work?
Well, again, it's important, you know, rapport, communication. A session like this today is invaluable. I can't tell you, it doesn't happen that often, but usually, you know, it happens when you're in the middle of competing, right? You meet the RFQ shows up, or the RFP, and then you're in the throes of working toward it, right? Dialogue is important. I think it's important that a manager can kind of bridge the gap between whatever institution is putting out the RFQ. That beforehand, they need to communicate with someone, a bridge, and you become a nexus between what works for artists. You know, some of the language doesn't work. You have to be careful that some of our rights aren't infringed upon. Right. I have to be a real stickler for not just defending myself as an individual, but the idea of an artist.
Mhm.
If I see something in a contract that I think is just not palatable, point that out to the organization. Often you'd be surprised. Oftentimes there's some like, oh, we can change that, so and so, right? So it isn't carved in stone. Don't accept it. So, there's some pushback, and the pushback isn't negative, but it's really building a more equitable community for all of us to work in. So your work as a manager is also important. If a communication between maybe the community and the artist as well. I mean, on the front end, it's the organization, but then the art has to go out into the community and live. So maybe there's some narrative that could happen. There's some pre-staging, I mean, I have been invited to situations when I'm invited as an artist to come and speak to a community that I'm about to create a piece for. And I walk in and the room is filled with like 500 people. And these people have been negotiating and back and forth this community for the last 10 years over this space and what's going to be there and what isn't going to be there. And I'm presented to them at the front of this space to talk about an idea of a piece, what I'm going to do. Well, that was an eye opener, but it just can't be the art showing up to the community. I had to start all over again.
Yeah, that seems like a really poor way to
start with talking to people, going to meetings, come in the evening, and they open with a prayer session, and then we start talking about art. So it's there's a narrative, there's a communication that has to happen.
So it sounds like you're saying just be a better facilitator between the artists and other stakeholders, community, architects, engineers. But you sort of led us into our next question, unless Lavi, you had a response for, how we can better serve you as an artist, as a public art manager.
I think that it's important that the manager already have a relationship with the agencies and the various like fabricators, structural engineers. A lot of these relationships are built on trust. And for me, I'm better served having a project manager who already has an established relationship with everyone that I have to deal with. And it just makes everything go a lot smoother. It makes me feel more confident as a first-time public art artist that the person that is speaking on my behalf, the person who is really advocating for my work and the integrity of my vision already knows all of the players. I think that that's really important. It has a good reputation among those players as well.
Great. So I'm looking at the time. I'm going to try to get to some of these important questions before we open up for Q&A. I'm curious. So there is a really long tradition of artists of African descent in art and architecture. And some of it may not be well known to others, but I'm curious if any of that is a source of inspiration to you. Are there any particular cultural traditions or artists of color that have been a source of inspiration for you in your work?
For me, growing up, I had an early awareness of Black architects shaping the built environment. I lived within walking distance of Paul Williams's designed headquarters of the Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company, which was one of the largest Black-owned life insurance companies in the country. And that building, I pass by that building every day in my West Adams neighborhood. When I set out to design a monument to honor Dr. Maya Angelou, it was really important to me that this monument be really grounded in an ethos of inclusion and Black aesthetics. So I looked at her personal art collection. I really responded to the works of Elizabeth Catlett, whom I've always admired, looked at Elizabeth Catlett's monument to Ralph Ellison, which is in Harlem, and it's a bronze monolith that's rectangular. So I looked at that form a lot. It was also important that even the materials that I employed were rooted in Blackness. So bronze, even though it is a material that's utilized in neoclassicism quite a bit, I looked at it from the perspective of a material that was indigenous to the Benin bronzes of West Africa. Metallurgy in that part of Africa was indigenous to the artisans there before Europeans even set foot on those shores. So Black aesthetics, from the concept to the materials, was just really important for me to embody in this work. Also, Mildred Howard's work, she is a artist and a dear friend on the West Coast who's created many public art projects around the country. She was not only an inspiration, but really a resource as I went through this process.
Thank you. And you introduced me to her work, so I appreciate that.
Yeah. I think, again, tapping into the experience of what African people have contributed to the world, when you talk about the Benin bronzes or the clay traditions, the building materials, the brick makers, I was really always struck with, who built this? And being in Washington, D.C., it's a city of monuments, right? And if you go back to the history, there were African people who helped build these structures, who built not only the structures, but made the bricks as well. That tradition was there. And then fantastic contemporary artists like Sam Gilliam, or David Driscoll, Barbara Chase-Verbeau, Elizabeth Catlett. It just is endless. It's so the wealth of ideas and ideologies and histories of, we're not newcomers to this place of creativity, this place of invention and space management. That's what we do. Yeah. So it's just full. You can blink, just turn around and, there's something that can inspire. I did a project some years ago, just in North Carolina, and it was near the North Carolina Museum of Art, and they were tearing down an old kind of prison there on some land that was given to them. And in doing the research, the prisoners themselves had made these bricks, at the beginning of the century. And it was just so interesting. When they tore it down, I went down and collected all the bricks and then built this monument at the crossroads between wild forest and the manicured thing. So it's this tradition that never dies. That's there, the spirit of all of those people contained for how many years, set free at the crossroads. Terracotta bricks. And you could see the color of those bricks, rich, red, deep earth. That's right there in North Carolina. That's that southern red clay. So it's never ending. It's this whirlwind that keeps blowing through humanity. And we are conductors.
Yep. Thank you. That was very well said. I think we have time for maybe one more question before we go to Q&A, and it's kind of it's packed with a lot. So bear with me, okay? So, there's been a lot of conversation around Confederate monuments and race. And a large part of that is just, how we've been, at least from the beginning of urban design in America, really excluded from, those policy roles. And now a lot of the work that we see has been informed by, an aesthetic that is not what you just described, right? So now we're trying to enter in this field, create works that represent, our culture, our aesthetic sense, our likabilities, and are running up against all of these biases and barriers that are even integrated into the way that we find opportunities in public art, the way that we have to apply to these opportunities. So, and I know that that's a broad, swath, but I'm just curious if any of that has impacted your work in a way that you can relay to us, or if you've experienced bias in a way that you can share and have any just thoughts or remedies for some of these really ingrained, inherent policies that, we're trying to get rid of?
I have lots of thoughts. I won't share them all. But one really important point that comes to mind, you spoke about Confederate monuments. The neoclassical ideal has dominated monument design for centuries, and that neoclassical ideal is what Confederate monuments are based on. And Confederate monuments were erected as part of a campaign by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Ku Klux Klan, Southern politicians, to subjugate and terrorize Black people under Jim Crow. So when you think about monuments to commemorate African-American individuals, we really need to separate, in my mind, we need to separate this idea of inclusion and diversity that not just means an increase of representations of ourselves, an increase of artists of color, Black artists who are creating these monuments, but also look closely at equity and inclusion as it relates to aesthetics. I believe that there needs to be a lot of educational programming that should be part of public art processes when communities are engaged, because the general public's preferences and tastes have largely been informed by what they've already seen. And there needs to be a campaign to really counter the neoclassical ideal, the primacy of neoclassicism, neoclassical statuary and monument design, to expand the public's imagination about what a monument can be, what it can look like. And that's something that I came up against in my monument design to Maya Angelou. And I'm just grateful that after a year plus long process where I was joined by the community, that my proposal was finally approved, but it is not a neoclassical statue, and shouldn't be.
Absolutely.
That's
Martha,
very eloquent. That was
yeah,
so
and
eloquent.
I want to pose that to you too, because I know that you've had experiences serving on committees that help select public art in DC, and been on boards and on panels. So I'm just wondering, from the artist selection standpoint, if you have any ideas about how we can just do that better.
You asked me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. First of all, Lava, that was just really very eloquent and so timely.
Absolutely.
I mean, these are issues that are just really pushed in our faces now with this kind of neoclassical reinvention of their history, and like putting it down everyone else's throat. So it's time to pull back the veil, and you do that through, as you say, really educating and exposing people to. I find that even communities that are tough, right? People have ideas, which is great. You want them to have passion and feedback. And if you communicate with them and talk and show and explain, they can understand, they can read it, they can see it, they feel it. If it's authentic, they know it. They can recognize something that's bogus in 5 seconds. So it is a matter of communicating. So when I sat on the thing is, sometimes once you get an award or something, you're asked to serve on the panel, right? Or you're asked to be there in place. And it's a very interesting exercise to go sit on a panel and judge, if you will, of work and to see it flash by for 1 second, The thing that I will say that I try to introduce when I'm asked to participate in the panel is to really try to look beyond just the 5-second, but to really try to look to see what the artist is trying to say with this body of work. And is it interesting, inventive? You know, is it going to edify if it's in the public sphere? It, you know, all of those things.
Martha, let me interject for a second.
Do I want to walk by it every day? These are issues that the community people need answered, you know?
Let me interject because I want to move us into Q&A, but that's such a really great point. One of my mentors in this field, because again, there's not a lot of Black public art policymakers and administrators that I know of, but her name is Constance White, and she always talks about judging, not necessarily, you know, do you have another $500,000 project under your belt on your CV, but can you demonstrate the capacity to come up with really amazing concepts that match community? And, you know, our role on the other end being helping you bring that to life. So that's a really great point that you raised in terms of evaluating opportunities. I want to thank both of you so much for sharing these ideas and your thoughts. The audience has some questions for you. And so I want to pivot to those, if you don't mind. And we have a few moments for that. So the first question that I see here is from my home girl, Miranda Kyle. She says, we know there is a gap in the representation of BIPOC artists in public art, particularly sculptures and monuments. For curators and admins, do you think building in those wraparound services Martha spoke to will help bring more Black, Indigenous, and people of color artists into the field? And should those services be built into the RFPQ?
I don't know if they're going to be built into the RFQ or P.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I think that they can, and I think that they absolutely should. But I'll let you go. Sorry, I just get excited.
The answer was, but will they? But will they? Okay. Yeah, I think the work has to happen before the RFQs and Ps come out. You know, the network that we talked about, forming the communication, and it has to be, the criteria has to be more than have you created a $500,000 project. Right now, I'm kind of dealing with, you know, there's a hierarchy. There's a movement from the beginning of, you know, accepting a commission. And let's be realistic. You kind of start at the lower rung, okay, in terms of money, the cost. We didn't bring any of that up. The financial part of public art and how you enter. So, and as you kind of move up in the experience, they want to see your management of budgets and management of all of those things and how it's done. So like anything and in our work, it is cumulative, right? Cumulative energy that follows you as an artist. We all know that. And I think it's a similar kind of thing in public art. Your identity and your cumulative energy follows you. So I don't know if that made much sense, but I will say that beginning, I had to put in much more than I got oftentimes. But artists, we work like that anyway, right? I'm never paid to the point where at the top of what I've already put in. And over the years, you know, when you talk about the Anacostia mosaic that's there, it's 400 feet. It wraps around that exterior building, and each piece of glass is hand-cut glass and set, right? And it took 3 years of building. I had to train 6 artists, and they had to sign a contract with me that you wouldn't leave. After I trained you on how to set glass mosaic, how to cut glass, you had to stay with me and work in the studio for 3 years. And we did that. Young people, that was a commitment. No way did they pay me for what the human energy, but I saw it as a gift to the community of Anacostia, one of my favorite communities in Washington, DC. It was paying homage to John Kennard, who started the the first little museum there in Anacostia. It was in an old movie theater for years. It later became the Anacostia Museum, part of the Smithsonian. So that community, which was cut off by the bridge, the freeway for years, right? It's a jewel. It sits on high ground. It has some of the most beautiful vistas over Washington, D.C. I saw it, and it was the first time that the public transportation was coming across the tracks, if you will, to that community. And that was, I think there are like maybe 2 stations where there's a whole building in the round. Most things are underground. I thought, this is a jewel. And how did it happen? It started out, they invited me to do like a little mural behind an escalator down the steps somewhere. God, right? Thank the creator, she was in place. And there was an artist who was an administrator at this organization and said, look at this space up here. Again, how can the manager of that place, if that artist wasn't in place as a manager to say to the organization, this is a better space, right? So working together, I got off the track, but at any rate, it takes a lot, and you have to put in more energy than you get oftentimes.
But Martha, I think one of the issues that I have is that you should be compensated for all of that. And, you know, even though you have the expertise in glass cutting and mosaics, which is amazing, you know, I like examples like how we see in New York, and shout out to the admins from New York here, you know, that will say, hey, we want to see your concept, we want to see your design, and we'll do the heavy lifting of partnering you with a fabricator. Because that equity that you're putting in, you know, there needs to be some dollars behind that. So
that was early on and years ago. I know.
Yes.
Listen, I can't do it. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next question from Sarah Rodrigo. We are trying to work more with artists who are new to public art and may not have connections to lawyers, engineers, studio managers, or even other public artists with the experience. How can we help artists connect with these professional networks? What was helpful for you when you had your first projects? I would just say, so for me, and I'll just take that really quickly as the public art project manager. One thing that's helpful is that the agencies that I've been affiliated with have been mounting projects for many, many years. And I will go through those files and say, okay, this artist is thinking about terrazzo. These are terrazzo fabricators that they've worked with, and we'll just have a list. And, you know, we'll ask, okay, how did that project go? So, and a lot of this, you know, we're talking about bidding own capacities into RFPs, creating resources for artists. It takes more effort and more work than I think we have the administrative time to do. I think we need more support, more staff, and to reimagine sort of what we think our role is. But, you know, the information and the data a lot of the times is there. And, you know, oftentimes if, you know, for example, if an artist that I'm working with needed insurance, I'll go look at a similar project and say, hey, well, you know, this insurance company provided the support for this artist, you know, and I can introduce you guys via email. It's just doing those sort of things. But I would just say looking through the records and the data and past projects, and, you know, creating a better, stronger partnership amongst other admins and curators to say, hey, do you know, of a good insurance person? And then creating a registry and a record of all of those different fields of expertise, I think is, you know, one way that we can help better serve artists. Another question, Lava talked about the value of personal invitation and encouragement. Martha talked about having the courage to apply. Could the artist speak about what elements they look for when considering if they will apply for a new RFQ? Are they looking for inspiring locations, themes, budgets, and are there certain types of projects or locations they will not apply to? That's a great question.
That is a great question. Since the Maya Angelou project is my first public art project, I can only speak to that. And the subject for me just really, you know, nailed it. After I was invited and encouraged to apply and realized that it was something that I could in fact do, it was really a no-brainer. I mean, what Black woman artist would not want to honor Dr. Maya Angelou with a public monument? So in the future, honestly, a lot of it has to do with how this particular experience plays out. As many of you probably already know, it started being incredibly challenging. It continues to present challenges that I view as learning opportunities, as growing and expanding opportunities. I've learned so much and have really relied on my community to inspire, encourage, and really help me create this. Will I create other public art projects? I really don't know. It's much easier for me to be a studio artist, to have complete control over my production and aesthetic output, because fortunately my work always ends up in the kinds of venues that I'm proud to see my work in.
Lava, I think that goes to one of the comments, just in terms of, your great capacity and genius, and, just sort of the labor that goes into doing public art. And Martha spoke to that too, in terms of the mosaic that she did for Anacostia. There's a comment here that says, can you talk about the expectations put on Black women artists right now in times of crisis, where there is unprecedented attention and pressure to perform or show up in certain ways that is often still in the service of a predominantly white art world?
Oh my God. Martha, you can take it while I think.
Thank you, Lava. You're so kind. Listen, we have enough to deal with and to figure out, and to be creative, and to keep that space that open enough to feel free to create, to think, to empathize with whatever it is that you see in front of yourself. And I fight to not have it clouded with the inability, it's an inhibition that you take on, that about white world and they're in control, and that's nonsense. Let's be inventive. It's time to drop the veil and begin to just evaluate what is important to us, to yourself, to communities. These issues are ever changing and complex. I think it's important to just be as strongly and vehemently yourself as you can, and then honestly present it to the world. What else can you do?
Right.
What can you do? Okay. And then the moment, and when you ask, like, will I apply? When I apply to something, I have this standard. Don't ever apply or design something that you don't like. That's the one that will sure to pick. Don't do it. If you have a design and you have 2 or 3, and you say, oh, this is a really one that I like, but I'm going to just submit these 2. Inevitably, they're going to select the one that's horrible. I don't build anything. I don't propose anything that I don't want to spend my human energy, my body. It's finite. Our time here is finite. Your energy is finite. The resources are finite. That's my criteria. Do I want to spend the next, at least a minimum of a year, 2 to 3 years, or some projects, we're talking 4 to 5 years out? Will it hold my interest, right? Those are questions you have to ask yourself. Only you can answer that. And the thing is, be honest with yourself. Nothing worse than having to deliver something that you don't like. I refuse to do it. So that's the standard you have to set, but you can set that for yourself. And if you do that, you will be respected for that.
I agree with you, Martha, 100%. I don't have the time or the energy or the inclination to work on something that I'm not proud of. And nothing will leave the studio that I'm not proud of. And it's just as simple as that. I do want to go back to the question, as I remember it framed, about the pressure that's placed on Black women. You know, after, well, in this era of racial reckoning that we find ourselves in, where institutions, organizations are being self-reflective in their culpability in Black artists' exclusion, Black artists' erasure, in particular Black women's erasure in certain arenas. And because of my experience with the Arts Commission and with San Francisco politics, I was inundated with invitations to speak, to be on panels, this, that, you know, people calling me, I had to take time to really protect myself. You know, I stepped back from social media. I just went into a period of self-reflection, self-protection, to honor my own creativity, to really recognize my own capacity to create and deliver. We are not responsible to, we don't have the responsibility to solve everybody's problems. They need to figure that out for themselves,
Right.
you know, and take a look and be respectful. You know, be respectful. Martha, when you talk about giving far more than we're compensated for, that labor, who's paying us for that? You know, and we should be compensated for that. We should definitely be compensated for that. In fields where we are the catalysts for change, where we're game changers, and many times in projects that I've been involved in, I end up being that person. There should be a premium
Yeah.
placed on that, because it's enormous. It is an enormous amount of work. And I've just learned to say no.
Yeah, that is an important word.
Yes.
Say no.
Yeah.
And it's not out of negativity, but you say it.
I
out
think
of
that's an
affection.
important note for the policymakers too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, I think I'm my internet is going like this, but I think that's an important note, what you just said, for those of us who shape opportunities, is to think about that as a whole other scope of work that deserves compensation.
Yes.
Or you know, to be noted in a contract. I think that we are out of time. I think this is supposed to end at 3, but we could talk about this for a very long time. And I really want to thank you, Lava. I really want to thank you, Martha. I just can't even begin to thank you enough for sharing your experiences and your thoughts with all of us, because we need to hear it. And it's a gift for all of us. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Lava,
the best with your project. The best
Thank you so
with
much.
with your monument. I'm so excited for you. That is such a wonderful blessing for all of us.
Yes, and it is for all of us.
Yes.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. Amina, you were great.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, thank you. I don't know. Are any of the folks from Forecast want to close this out or bye? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say a few closing thoughts. I'm sad to have to end this, because I'm just looking at the chat, and I hope our speakers get to read the thanks coming in, because there's just incredible things that I just want to honor and agree with, of this being a really phenomenal and incredibly inspiring conversation that I'd love to see continue. This is just a first of many. I hope Forecast can continue to facilitate and support these kind of conversations. I'm looking to all of you and to folks participating today to please reach out if you have ideas or thoughts about other conversations and topics that we can host, and we would love to do that as a part of this ongoing series. I'll also just note that, because I just believe in putting something out in the world, so I hope in the next few years we can come together in person have an in-person summit about the future of public art policy through the lens of racial justice, and that we could do that in person and together. And so I'm putting that out into the world, hoping that happens and that people here today want to come together with us and make that happen. I also just want to invite people to participate in Amina's survey. That's a part of your Change Lab fellowship. I'm assuming that's still open, and we can include that in the chat. Yes. So this is a survey conducted as a part of Amina's research, looking at racial justice in public art across the country, and the results will be utilized in a report that Forecast will share to examine challenges, barriers, and best practices in commissioning BIPOC and Alana artists in public art projects, and provide data-driven recommendations for policy change. So please check that out before you go participate and include that chat or participate in that survey. So that's it, I think. Thank you so much for coming together. Thank you, Lava and Martha and Amina and Mallory and everybody who makes this possible. I can't wait for the next conversation, and just wishing everybody a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye,
Happy New
everyone.
Year.
Happy New Year.